Hello everyone, welcome once again. This is part 2 of the process boundaries, key inputs and outputs using SIPOC. In the part 1 we talked about what is process mapping, what is a process. We talked about the different symbols that we use in process mapping. We talked about what are different views of of the process, and we said it should be the way process actually happens, what it actually is rather than what it should be. So that tells us the current state of the process, and from there where we want to be. So that's what we try to understand, and we are trying to understand a method called SIPOC that we'll talk now, which is nothing but a high level process mapping method. So as part of this, we need to understand there are different levels of process mapping that we first need to know before we try to map a process. So in this slide you can see we're talking about 3 levels of mapping a process. The first level talks about level 1, which is a very macro process map. So macro process map talks about a process at an organizational level will not be more than 6 to 7 steps. For example, if I go back to the same example that I said in part 1, when you apply for a bank loan, the 6 to 7 process step will be apply for a bank loan on the lender's website, provide information, loan gets processed, loan gets approved, then loan gets disbursed, receive money in the account. 6-step process, simple. That's a very high level understanding of this process. Now their second step can be the process map, which is also called as a little detailed process map, level 2 process map, wherein we're talking about a little less departmental level, wherein you log into bank website, apply for a bank loan, select the right type of loan, apply for a loan, and customer representative visits your house, provide documents, do a follow-up, submit documents, loan gets processed, loan gets approved, loan gets disbursed, getting amount in your bank account. So you see 8 to 10 steps. That's little departmental level of process map. But then third comes the micro level of process map, very detailed, very specific transaction level process map. Opening the bank website, selecting the right type of loan onto the bank website, finding it first, then selecting it, clicking on it, filling your details in it, providing your PAN card details, personal detail in it, submitting the form, receiving the reference ID, receiving a call from the bank, providing all details related to your requirement, and then getting a confirmation ID. Then you get contacted by the bank representative. So you see, by this point itself I have covered around 10-12 steps, which was actually the only step number 1 in the macro process step. So these are the different level of process mapping we need to do. In the define phase, we don't do all these detailed process step. We only do the first level of process mapping, which is a detailed process step, the macro process step. That's what we are concerned about, and we call it the high level process mapping. So if you look at this slide, what kind of questions we're asking before we do a process mapping? Who are the customer of the process? Who performs this activity? What generates the process or the task? What forms and reports are used? What computer systems and files are used? How do we do it? Why do we do it? What decisions are made in the process, and what happens next? What sequence are the activities performed in? Who reviews it, and then how long does it take? What is the nature, frequency and cause of errors or problem? How are errors, problem, exceptions handled? What is the output? How many? Where does the output go? We may not be asking all the questions, but we ask almost many of these questions that you see here. One key part that you see, one of the questions that I mentioned here, what is the nature, frequency and cause of the errors and problem? How are errors, problem, exception handled? Maybe we do not want to ask this question now. We want to ask this question in the later part, which we are going to cover as part of the major phase. So we may not be asking them right now. If you look at the next slide, talks about the do's and don'ts of this entire process mapping activity. Certain things which are guidelines, I put them that way, that do map the process as it actually happens. We talked about it. Do think about the process across the entire organization. That means do not have a narrow mind that I am going to talk about only in my department. You have to look at this process from the entire organization point of view. You have to talk to other people who are involved in the process. Now what are we doing here? It is a brainstorming activity with the help of a team. You can't do it alone. That's a key thing to remember. You don't do it in your own way, in a piece of paper or in an Excel sheet. No, we don't do it. You work with the team and then you do it. And you map the process at a high level. We talked about it, and it must have a beginning and an end. That's again the key thing we already talked. Beginning and end come from the scope that we discussed during the charter activity. And do ask questions, obviously. What you should not do: you should not map the process the way it should be, because we are not preparing a future state right now. Don't restrict a process map to the activities in your own department. Of course, we talked about it. Don't work in a vacuum. That means work with people. Don't work alone. And don't get bogged down with too many details. That, as I said, don't make it very complex. Keep it 6 to 7 steps maximum. Don't put so much of information. And do not attempt to make a process map until you know where is the boundary, where is it process beginning, where is it ending. So these details are very important before we start mapping the process. Now, in this slide, we talk about a high level process mapping method called SIPOC, SIPOC. S stands for supplier, I stands for input, P stands for process, O stands for output, C stands for customer. So we talked about the supplier and the input part of it. Let's explain each of them, what do they are. So in the next slide, we talk about the entire activity. If you look at to the right column here, input and supplier. Where does the information or material you work on come from? Means who are the suppliers for information in a particular process? Who are your suppliers? What do they supply? Where do they affect the process flow? What effect do they have on the process and on the outcome? And we also talk about what are the key inputs which are important for a process to perform, for a process step. Then the process steps. What happens to each input that goes into a process step? What conversion activities take place in a process step? And if we talk about the outputs, why does this what product does this process make? That's the output part we are talking. What are the output of this particular process and each of this step if possible, and at what point does the process end? Some key information about this. And the customers, from the customer point of view, we talk about who uses the product from this process, who are the customer of this process. These are the certain understanding. And if I simply put it together in this example, what we're trying to say here is, you have a process step. We write 6 to 7 process steps. Then we write the output of each of the process steps, the process output received from each of the process steps. Then we write the customer who will receive those process outputs. We write it there. So we have written the process steps, we have written the process inputs, the outputs, and we have written the customer who will receive those inputs. Then we write the process inputs, the inputs that are going into the process at each step. Then we write the supplier who are providing you those inputs that you have written in the input column. That's how the SIPOC is prepared. So we start from the P, we go to O, we go to C, then we write the I and S. So SIPOC is prepared typically POC IS as a flow. It is not a standard flow. That's how I have done it. That's how a lot of practitioners do it. You can also draw your own flow, but this is the most common flow that you will see while you're preparing a SIPOC. This is an example in front of you where you can see that we have prepared a SIPOC. You can see the key process steps, 6 to 7 steps. You can see the key process outputs. You can see the key customer who received those outputs. You can also see the key inputs which are used at different steps of this process steps. And you can see the key supplier who are giving us those key inputs here. So SIPOC job is not only, this tool is to understand the start and end point of the process. It's very important. SIPOC becomes very important part of this entire activity, because what happens is, while you are working to improve a process, there may be certain metrics that you want to improve out of a project. Let us say you want to improve turnaround time as a metric. Now turnaround time is a metric coming from the process step. How much time do you take to complete the job? That's a process step, process metric. But then turnaround time is a process metric, depends on the input metric, the input that goes into a process. Then supplier provides their input. So metrics are dependent on different columns in SIPOC. Output, for example, talk about quality, productivity. These are all the output related metric. You cannot improve any of the output related metric unless you improve the process step unless you improve the input that goes into. It's a very famous saying, if an input is bad, the output will also be bad. So if you're trying to directly improve the output, that will not work. You have to fix the process step part, input part, and the supplier part. We discussed the same thing in y equal to fx equation also, where we said you monitor the y and control the x. Y is the output, x is the input. Same thing we are doing in SIPOC also. So this was a session about how to map the process at a high level, how to understand what are inputs, what are outputs, what are customer, supplier, and that's how we try to put together a high level process map in a process. This is about SIPOC. Thank you once again. This is Shivendra Sharma.